Cops arrested a black man at a gas station. Next day, he's the judge presiding over their hearing. At a small gas station late at night, police officers handcuffed a black man in front of strangers, treating him like a criminal. They laughed, they mocked, and they dragged him away without mercy. But what they didn't know was the shocking truth. The very next morning, inside the courtroom, the same man they arrested would walk in wearing a judge's robe, and they would be the ones standing before him. It was a quiet evening in Philadelphia when Marcus Holloway, a respected judge with years of service behind the bench, pulled into a gas station. To anyone watching, he was just another man stopping to fuel up his car after a long day. He wore no robe, carried no gavel, and had no badge of honor with him. He was simply Marcus, a black man dressed in casual clothes, minding his own business. But in America, even a man of stature can be reduced to nothing in a matter of moments when the color of his skin becomes the only thing people see. Marcus had learned long ago that respectability did not shield him from prejudice. He had grown up hearing his father's warnings that no matter how educated, successful, or wealthy he became, there would always be people who looked past his achievements and saw only the color of his skin. Still, Marcus believed that his position as a judge placed him in a different category, someone who could not be so easily dismissed or mistreated. That belief shattered that night as he stood by the pump, headlights washed over him. A police cruiser pulled into the station, slowing near his car. The officers inside had been looking for a suspect described as a black male in dark clothing. Without hesitation, their eyes locked on Marcus. He matched enough of the vague description to draw suspicion. For them, that was reason enough. What began as a simple refueling stop turned into an encounter that would leave Marcus shaken. The officers approached with authority, their hands near their holsters, their voices sharp. He tried to explain who he was, tried to steady his tone, but his words were brushed aside. To them, he was not a judge. He was not a man who spent years studying the law. He was just another black man who looked like someone they claimed they were searching for. The humiliation deepened when one of them pulled out handcuffs. Cold steel pressed against his wrists, and the sound of the cuffs locking echoed louder than the gas pump ever could. People at the station watched. Some turned away, unwilling to involve themselves. Others stared, whispering. Marcus felt the sting of shame rise in his chest, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his dignity was stripped away in public, in front of strangers. Without justification, the ride to the station was a blur. Flashing lights painted the inside of the cruiser, and Marcus stared at the dividing screen in disbelief. Every part of him screamed that this was wrong, but he sat in silence, knowing that raising his voice might only make things worse. He thought of all the cases he had presided over, all the men and women he had sentenced, and all the officers who had testified before him. Never in his life did he imagine being on the other side, treated like a criminal when he was supposed to represent justice itself. Hours passed at the precinct. He was processed like any other detainee, forced to wait while officers questioned him about things he knew nothing about. It wasn't until his identity was confirmed, until someone finally realized who they had in custody, that the tone shifted. Apologies came quickly, excuses even quicker. But apologies could not undo the humiliation he had endured. The damage was done. When Marcus finally walked out of the station that night, free to go, he carried more than just anger. He carried a deep wound, a reminder that no title, no robe, no authority could fully protect him from being reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of those sworn to uphold the law. But fate had prepared a twist. Because by the time the sun rose the next day, Marcus would not just be a man wronged. He would be a judge again, and the very men who had humiliated him would find themselves standing in front of his bench, awaiting his decision. Morning light crept into Marcus Holloway's home, but it brought no peace. Sleep had been shallow, haunted by the memory of cold steel around his wrists, and the piercing stares of officers who saw him not as a man, not as a judge, but as a suspect. He rose before dawn, his body moving on routine, but his mind clouded with disbelief. The reflection staring back at him in the mirror was the same face, the same man. Yet overnight, the world had stripped away his dignity. The robe hanging in his closet seemed heavier than ever. Black fabric that once symbolized justice, authority, and respect now felt like a fragile shield, easily pierced by prejudice. Marcus had worn it countless times, stepping into courtrooms where men and women waited for his judgment. Each time he carried the weight of fairness, knowing the decisions he made could alter lives. But now the robe mocked him. How could he represent justice when justice had failed him so completely the night before? Still, duty called. Judges could not simply disappear because of personal pain. The courthouse awaited him, and inside those walls the law still demanded his presence. Marcus drove in silence, every street light and intersection pulling him closer to a reality he hadn't anticipated. He reminded himself to breathe, to push the anger aside, to focus on the responsibilities ahead. When he arrived at the courthouse, clerks and staff greeted him with their usual courtesy. None of them knew what had happened the previous night. None of them saw him handcuffed at a gas station, treated as less than a man. He walked through the hallways like he always did, but with every step the echo of humiliation followed him. The robe covered his body, but it could not cover the wound left in his spirit. Then came the moment that fate had designed, a twist more surreal than anything Marcus could have imagined. On his docket for the day appeared a case involving police misconduct. The names attached to the report struck him like thunder. They were the very same officers who had arrested him. For a moment he froze, staring at the paperwork in disbelief. He read the names again, certain his mind must be playing tricks, but the letters remained. The officers who had humiliated him, who had dismissed his words, who had locked him in cuffs as strangers watched, they would be standing before his bench. They would be under his authority. They would be judged by the man they thought they could strip of dignity. The irony was heavy, almost cruel. He remembered the smirk of one officer as he was led into the station, the casual disregard in their eyes as they treated him like a suspect. Now they would stand in the position of defendants, forced to answer for their actions. Marcus could feel the weight of his anger pressing against his chest, urging him to wield his power as vengeance. But deep within, another voice whispered, the voice of the law. The oath he had sworn, the promise to rise above personal pain. He sat in his chambers, robe draped across his shoulders, wrestling with the conflict inside him. The man within him, the victim of humiliation, longed to see them squirm, to remind them who he was. But the judge within him, the man who had spent his life dedicated to fairness, knew that justice could not be about revenge. Justice demanded more. Justice demanded restraint, even when restraint felt impossible. The time drew near. Marcus closed the file and steadied himself. Outside, the courtroom was filling with people. Lawyers, reporters, and curious onlookers gathered, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the calm expression of the man about to take the bench. He knew the moment his gavel struck wood, the world would change. Not just for him, not just for the officers, but for everyone watching. With a final deep breath, Marcus stood, ready to face the courtroom. The robe weighed heavy on his shoulders, but this time it was not a burden. It was a reminder that while others could strip him of dignity in the dark of night, in the light of day, his role as a judge gave him something they could never take away, the power to define justice. As he opened the door to the courtroom, the murmurs inside fell to silence. All eyes turned toward him. The officers waited, shifting nervously, realizing for the first time who stood before them. Marcus lifted the gavel, and with that sound, the tables had turned. The air in the courtroom was thick with silence, the kind that presses against the skin and makes even the smallest sound echo louder than it should. When Judge Marcus Holloway entered, his robe flowing behind him, the entire room shifted. Lawyers straightened their backs, clerks adjusted their papers, and the public gallery leaned forward, sensing something unusual. But no one felt the weight of the moment more than the two police officers seated at the defense table. They recognized him instantly. Their eyes widened, their posture stiffened, and for a brief second, the confidence they wore on the streets melted into unease. Just 24 hours earlier, They had seen this same man as nothing more than a suspect. They had dismissed his words, ignored his protests, and shackled his wrists as if he were beneath them. Now he sat above them, elevated on the bench, the symbol of authority they could not escape. Marcus lifted his gavel, the sound of wood striking wood commanding attention. The trial was not about him, but the irony was undeniable. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom flickered between the officers and the judge, whispering in hushed tones as realization spread. This was not just a hearing. It was a collision of two worlds, one where power had been abused, and another where justice demanded accountability. Inside, Marcus felt the storm raging. He remembered every detail of the night before: the flashing lights, the tight cuffs, the humiliation of being paraded like a criminal. Anger clawed at his chest, begging to be unleashed, but he steadied his voice, reminding himself that this was not about revenge. It was about showing the difference between lawless authority and lawful justice. The case began. Attorneys stood, their words filling the room, presenting arguments about misconduct, abuse of power, and the officer's record of questionable stops. Witnesses stepped forward, recounting their encounters, describing moments where the badge became a weapon instead of a shield. Marcus listened, his face calm, but his mind weighed every word, every gesture, every subtle attempt to twist the truth. The officers, who once carried themselves with arrogance, now sat uneasily, their eyes lowered. For the first time, they were forced to feel what they had inflicted on others: the scrutiny, the judgment, the loss of control. They were no longer the enforcers. They were the judged. The public gallery was restless. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens trying to capture the magnitude of the moment. The story of a black judge presiding over the case of the officers who had arrested him spread quickly, whispers turning into headlines. Cameras waited outside, ready to beam the irony to the world. The nation would soon know how power could shift in a single day. Marcus kept his focus. He leaned on the principles that guided his career: fairness, impartiality, and the unwavering belief that justice must be blind, even when his heart burned with personal scars. He knew that how he handled this case would ripple beyond these walls. If he faltered, if he let anger take control, critics would say he proved the stereotypes true. But if he remained steady, he could turn his pain into a lesson, not just for the officers before him, but for everyone watching. Hours stretched on. Testimonies layered upon each other, each one adding weight to the truth. The officers shifted in their seats, the gravity of their situation sinking deeper with each passing moment. They had once believed their uniforms made them untouchable. Now, stripped of that shield, they faced accountability under the eyes of the very man they had wronged. As the session drew to a close, Marcus tapped his gavel once more. The sound cut through the room, sharp and final. He announced that the hearing would continue the next day, giving everyone time to prepare for closing arguments. The officers exhaled, relieved for the pause, but their relief was hollow. They knew that tomorrow would not erase what had already been revealed. Marcus stood, his robe trailing behind him, as he exited the courtroom. Outside, reporters surged forward, shouting questions, cameras flashing like lightning. But Marcus said nothing. He walked past them, his face calm, his silence louder than any words. The city was beginning to awaken to the story. A judge wrongfully arrested, now presiding over the hearing of the very men who had humiliated him. The irony was too powerful to ignore, and the people wanted to know what would happen next. But deep inside Marcus's heart, the question was heavier. Could he truly separate the man who had been humiliated from the judge sworn to be fair? That question would follow him into the night, setting the stage for what was yet to come. The night after the first hearing was restless for Marcus Holloway. He sat alone in his study, surrounded by stacks of case files, the dim glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had spent years building a reputation as a fair and balanced judge, a man who carried the law with dignity. Yet now his private humiliation had spilled into the public arena. What happened at the gas station was no longer just a personal wound. It had become a national conversation. Outside his home, the world was changing. News anchors debated the case with fiery urgency. Headlines splashed across screens. Judge arrested, now presiding over case against arresting officers. The story spread like wildfire, not because it was ordinary, but because it exposed the fragile line between justice and injustice. For some, Marcus became a symbol of resilience, proof that dignity could not be permanently stripped away. For others, the situation was uncomfortable, a mirror held up to the system, reflecting truths that many tried to deny. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended overnight, voices rose in outrage, and videos from the gas station surfaced online. Strangers who had witnessed the arrest shared their accounts, confirming the humiliation Marcus endured. People replayed the image of a black man in handcuffs, not realizing he was a judge, not knowing his status, and questioned how often this happened to those without his authority. Marches began forming in Philadelphia, spilling into the streets, candles lit and voices chanting. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for all, accountability now, and no one is above the law." The arrest of a sitting judge, for no reason other than vague suspicion, became the spark for something larger. Marcus watched from his window as people outside his home carried his name on banners, their voices lifting his story into a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. But the attention was a double-edged sword. Support poured in, but so did criticism. Detractors accused Marcus of bias, questioning whether he should even preside over the case. Commentators claimed he would seek revenge, that his personal anger would cloud his judgment. Others dismissed the incident altogether, arguing that the officers were simply doing their jobs. Marcus read these words silently, knowing that the scrutiny was inevitable. The world was watching his every move, waiting to see whether he would bend or break under the weight of expectation. Meanwhile, the officers themselves felt the heat. Once protected by the shield of their uniforms, they now faced relentless media coverage, their names circulating across the nation. Their families received calls, their reputations crumbled, and the community they once patrolled began to see them differently. They had not just arrested a man, they had arrested a judge, and in doing so, had pulled the curtain back on a reality many could no longer ignore. The courthouse, too, transformed. On the morning of the second hearing, crowds gathered outside. Protesters lined the sidewalks, cameras pointed at every entrance, and whispers filled the halls. Reporters jostled for space, desperate to capture the image of Marcus walking into court. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Lawyers tightened their arguments, aware that their words would not only be heard by the judge, but dissected by a nation hungry for answers. Marcus arrived with his robe folded carefully over his arm. He felt the weight of every camera flash, every gaze fixed on him, every unspoken question in the air. But as he stepped into the courtroom, he reminded himself of the vow he had made long ago, to uphold justice no matter the cost. He could not control what people said about him. He could not control the storm outside the courthouse. But he could control his courtroom, and within those walls, the law would speak louder than any headline. The hearing resumed, the evidence building, the tension rising. Each moment felt heavier than the last, as if the entire country were holding its breath. For Marcus, the line between personal pain and professional duty blurred, but he knew one thing with certainty. His decision would not just define this case. It would define his legacy, and as the day ended, with arguments still hanging in the air, the question remained, when the gavel finally fell, would Marcus deliver justice as a man wronged or as a judge bound by the law? The courthouse stood like a fortress under siege. Crowds gathered at dawn, their chants echoing through the streets, their banners raised high against the morning sky. Television vans lined the block, their satellite dishes aimed upward, feeding every development to a nation that could not look away. Inside those stone walls, Judge Marcus Holloway prepared to confront the most defining moment of his career. The hearing had stretched for days, each session peeling back another layer of the truth. Witnesses had testified about the officer's history of overreach, of stops made without reason, of patterns too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. Others defended the men, painting them as loyal servants of the community who had simply made a mistake. The arguments clashed like thunder in the courtroom, each side fighting not only for the case, but for the story that would live in history. For Marcus, every word cut deeper than it should have. He remembered the humiliation of cold cuffs around his wrists, the disbelief in strangers' eyes as he was led away. Yet he forced himself to remain steady, his face carved from stone, his gavel striking with precision whenever order faltered. The robe weighed heavy on his shoulders, a reminder that his role was larger than his anger, larger than his pain. The officers sat silently, their confidence long gone. They avoided his gaze, their shoulders hunched, their hands restless. They were not the same men who had stepped so boldly onto that gas station lot. Stripped of their power, they were exposed, vulnerable, waiting for the judgment of the very man they once dismissed as less than human. Beyond the walls, the story consumed the nation. Commentators speculated on the outcome, activists declared the trial a turning point, and critics questioned whether Marcus could truly be impartial. But those closest to the judge knew the battle raging inside him was more intense than any public debate. He was not just deciding a case. He was deciding who he would be when the gavel struck for the last time. As the hearing reached its final phase, the courtroom grew restless. Lawyers delivered closing arguments, their voices rising with urgency, each syllable designed to sway not only the judge, but the court of public opinion. One painted the officers as reckless, blind to the humanity of the people they swore to protect. The other pleaded for leniency, arguing that their actions, though flawed, were not malicious. Marcus listened, his mind a battlefield of reason and emotion. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone knew the decision now rested solely with him. The officers shifted in their seats, their families clasped their hands in prayer, and the crowd held its breath as Marcus rose from his bench. But he did not deliver a verdict that day. Instead, he spoke only a few words, words that announced his ruling would be delivered in the next session. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, disappointment mixing with suspense. But Marcus knew the delay was necessary. He needed the night to reflect, to weigh the scales of justice against the fire of his anger. When he stepped out of the courtroom, the crowd surged forward, questions flying like arrows. He ignored them, his silence deliberate, his resolve unshaken. That night he sat alone once more, staring at the gavel resting on his desk. The wood was smooth, familiar, a tool he had used for years. But tomorrow it would carry more weight than ever before. He thought of his father's words spoken long ago. Justice is not about what you feel, Marcus. It's about what you know is right. And so, as the city braced for the final hearing, Marcus prepared himself. The time for hesitation was over. Tomorrow, the nation would hear his verdict. The city held its breath. From the crowded courthouse steps to the living rooms of families watching on television, everyone waited for the moment that had been building for days. The courthouse, already a symbol of law, now felt like the center of the nation's conscience. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, every cough, every shuffle of paper amplified in the silence. When Judge Marcus Holloway entered the courtroom, the room rose in unison. He carried himself with quiet authority, the black robe flowing behind him, his face unreadable. But inside the storm raged. The humiliation of the gas station lingered in his memory, but so did the weight of the oath he had taken. He was not here for vengeance. He was here for justice. The officers sat rigid at the defense table, their eyes fixed on the wood grain before them, unable to meet his gaze. They had spent their careers cloaked in power, their word often taken above all others. But now, stripped of that shield, they sat as men waiting to be judged. The irony was not lost on anyone. Marcus lifted his gavel, and the room fell silent. His voice carried across the courtroom, calm but firm, each word deliberate. He recounted the evidence, the testimonies, the patterns that had emerged. He acknowledged the defense's arguments, but laid bare the truth revealed through the hearing, that the officers' actions had crossed the line, that their authority had been misused, and that the humiliation inflicted on innocent men and women was not isolated, but systemic. He spoke not only as a judge, but as a man who had lived the reality of their misconduct. Without ever mentioning his own arrest, his words carried the weight of that night, unspoken yet undeniable. His tone sharpened when he reminded the court that a badge is not a license to demean, and authority without accountability corrodes justice itself. The verdict was clear. The officers were found guilty of misconduct, their actions declared a violation of both the law and the public trust. The sentence was not just a punishment, but a statement, a suspension from duty, mandatory retraining, and a permanent mark on their records. It was a ruling that told the city and the nation that justice could not be bent to favor those who wore a uniform. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others wept, and the officers sat in stunned silence, the weight of the decision sinking into their bones. Reporters rushed to capture every reaction, their cameras flashing as history unfolded. Outside, the crowd roared, chants of victory and justice echoing through the streets. Marcus sat quietly, his gavel resting in his hand. He did not smile, nor did he revel in the downfall of the men who had humiliated him. His face remained calm, his posture steady, because this was never about revenge. It was about proving that even when the system fails, it can also correct itself. As he left the bench, the room stood again, not just out of respect for the robe, but for the man who wore it. Marcus walked past the officers without a glance, his steps measured, his shoulders squared. For him, the true victory was not their punishment, but his restraint. He had shown the world that justice is strongest when it resists the pull of anger. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the courthouse steps where crowds still gathered. The chants of the people rose higher, not just for Marcus, but for the possibility of a system that could hold even its protectors accountable. That night, when Marcus finally returned home, he placed his gavel on the desk and sat in silence. The memory of humiliation was still there, but it no longer defined him. What defined him was the choice he had made, to rise above, to let justice, not anger, speak through him. And in that choice, he had done more than deliver a verdict. He had delivered a message that no man, no matter his badge or title, is above the law. And that's how a night of humiliation turned into a powerful lesson, that no one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge. If this story moved you, don't leave without hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. More powerful true stories are coming your way, and you won't want to miss the next one.